Our final character of the classic period would be Beethoven. Beethoven is an interesting character, though, because when we talk about him, he is not strictly a classical period composer. Where Mozart and Haydn pretty much exemplified the classic period, Beethoven was more of a guy who was the transitional figure between the classical period and the Romantic period. His earlier music and his middle period music as well pretty much exemplified great classic period writing. The forms were at times a hint longer than you might find in, say, Mozart's work, but in general, proper forms and not really anything too out of the ordinary. But by his later part of the middle period, things started to get longer. He used more harmonic clashes, did not always follow the forms, like sonata form, exactly as the textbooks would tell you to do. And really, by the time of his Ninth Symphony especially, he was not writing at all in the classic model. He was more of a romantic composer and exemplified romantic composition. Again, that's more towards the end of his career. So actually you end up having a test question asking you about the Ninth Symphony exemplifying classic composition, and that would be false. The Ninth Symphony represents Romantic period composition. Anyway, some interesting things about Beethoven. First of all, you always hear, oh, Beethoven was deaf. If Beethoven had been born deaf and still decided to become a musician, that would have been a really stupid career choice. So, keep in mind, Beethoven was not always deaf. Beethoven started losing his hearing about the middle of his career, and by the time he was at the very end of his career, he had lost his hearing. At that point, he had learned enough about music and had written enough music that he could hear music in his head and had a pretty good idea what everything was sounding like. So it wasn't like, oh, he's just writing, this deaf guy's writing music. He had a pretty good idea what he was doing. So keep that in mind, that Beethoven was not always deaf. Whenever someone talks about the deaf composer Beethoven, it wasn't quite like that. Now, Beethoven had a bit of a reputation for being how shall we say, an unpleasant figure. He had kind of a bad temper and did not like to work under people. As a result, he did not work in the patronage system. But for Beethoven, his nastiness kind of earned him popularity, and he was such an amazing composer, he could write so quickly, that he still made a very good living by writing little fragments and little compositions for whoever would employ him. So by selling his compositions, Beethoven avoided working for the aristocracy and made a pretty good living doing that. Beethoven didn't write a lot of stuff for voice. He did write one opera, but much of the music he wrote for vocal parts was kind of like what other composers would write for strings, especially in a symphony like the Ninth Symphony. Again, this is getting into more the Romantic period. But in the Ninth Symphony, you hear voices working like strings. They're more of a background constant part rather than being there to be a main melody. They were just another instrument. And that's how he often used voice.